Mr. Dominic Barton, will now address us. His topic couldn't be more appropriate. How do companies stay winners when times are volatile? Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Mr. Barton.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here and to be the hors d'oeuvres for more interesting speakers coming up after me. I have about 7 minutes to get through a number of things, and what I really wanted to focus on was two things. One is the times that we're living in, which we believe are literally the most interesting times in a 500-year time frame. And I want to talk about why, what are some of the forces which are leading us to say that, and then secondly, to talk about the strategic imperatives that come from living and operating in these times. And many of these shifts that I talk about, they're all actually happening here in India, so I can think of no better of a place to talk about these shifts as we move through it. So why do we think these times, this next 20 to 30 years, are going to be some of the most interesting in our history? It's really because of at least three fundamental forces that in our view are like gravity. It's not what's happening in the markets and so forth, it's more gravitational. And the three are as follows. First, that we're seeing a technological revolution. Raj mentioned that we're sort of in chapter 1 of probably a 100-chapter book on the technology revolution. Second is we're seeing urbanization occur at a rate we've never seen in our history. Again, this is the center of where that is going to be happening over the next 20 to 30 years. And we're aging as a world. Fortunately, not so much here, but in the rest of the world, we're getting really old. As I get older, I think that's not such a bad thing, but it's a factor we're going to have to deal with. Those three forces are things that we have to look at. On the technology front, I think that there are a number of drivers that are leading to fundamental business model changes for everyone. It isn't just the retailers and the media companies and consumer goods companies and telecom organizations. It's steel companies, it's industrial companies, and it's governments that are all being faced by this. And it's being driven by the first factor, which is just data. Every 2 days, as human beings, we collect more data than we have in our previous 2,000 years. Every 2 days, 2,000 years worth. Unfortunately, 95% of that data is useless. But we're getting better and better about how to use that information over time. So we're collecting a humongous amount of information, and that will continue to accelerate. We are also seeing massive advances in computing power, just the power that computers have. The one way, from my simple mind, I look at it is the average hire washing machine, I think John Rice at GE, the average hire washing machine has more computing power than the Apollo 11 had when they sent a man to the moon. That's the sort of power in a washing machine. If you then take it to a little more technological level, if you think about the processing power that we're looking at, we're at the level of an insect brain, which may not sound that exciting, but it's actually quite sophisticated. And I think in the next 20 to 25 years, we get toward the human brain in terms of just the processing power that we have. And we are much more connected. We've got 3.2 billion people on the planet that are wired up. You put all of that together, and you're going to get very significant disruption. And it's happening in many areas. The mobile internet, we're seeing it in robotics, we're seeing it in the automation of work. I mean, in McKinsey, we like to tell other people what they should do. We often don't take our own medicine, which is a problem. When I look at automation of work, about 40% of what we can do probably can be done by machines. It's probably not a good thing to talk about amongst all of you, but this artificial intelligence and what machine learning is doing is a very significant disruption. New genomics, if you think about changes in energy storage and so forth, just very significant shifts that will alter business models. Digitization is a topic that we're all familiar with. I think the challenge here is that it's happening so fast that it's very difficult for everyone to deal with it. I'd say 3 years ago, about 5% of the average businesses were being affected by digital. If you were a retailer, obviously, when what your consumers were looking at and buying products and the internet was affected by that. But now we would argue that's gone to about 25%. So 5% to 25%. And it's not just how you interact with consumers, it's your processes. A lot of the benefits from digitization are actually in processes, not just to do with what's happening with the consumer. So many changes that are going to be underway on the technology side. Urbanization is another force. It's, in my view, very much like gravity. 20 million people a year have been moving from rural areas to cities in China over the last 20 years. Through the SARS crisis, H1N1, through the great financial crisis, they keep moving. And that's happening here in India. We're going to see 2.2 billion new middle-class consumers entering the planet over the next 20 years. That is nothing, we've never seen anything like that in our history. It's about 1,000 times larger than the Industrial Revolution in terms of size and speed with which it's occurring. And again, that gravitational force, I think, makes me feel optimistic about demand and what consumers are going to be doing. It's going to present challenges in terms of resource usage. So we are seeing very low commodity prices today with oil and copper and so forth. I personally do not think we are going to see that over time as that 2.2 billion consumes more over time. So we're going to have to think about that. Cities are going to be much more important. About 424 cities account for 50% of the GDP growth that we're going to see over the next 20 years. A good chunk of those cities are here in India, but they're also in other parts of Asia and Africa. So the power shift in the world is well underway. And reflecting that, we're going to see half of the $1 billion plus organizations in 2025 will be in Asia, in this region, a significant shift over time. So no matter where you are in the world, you have to be thinking about this part of the world in terms of consumers and also in the competition. And some of the new shifts that are going on, like the One Belt, One Road, the Silk Road, we're going to see 81,000 kilometers of railway being built. We're going to unleash economic power in a region that most people are frightened to travel in. I think it's going to be a very exciting area in which we're going to see more business being done, and India is very well positioned in that. The final force is around the aging population. I mentioned we are getting older as a planet. Just a couple of things on that. There'll be more people that are over the age of 65 than under the age of 14 in the year 2050. We've never had that happen before. In Italy, Japan, and Spain, 1/3 of the population will be over the age of 65. That has very significant implications on many dimensions, but two just to point out. Labor productivity. A big driver of labor productivity is actually more workers coming into the workforce. People don't, I think, remember this enough, but one of the biggest pushes in the United States productivity growth in the 70s and 80s was women going into the workforce. It accounted for about 40% of the productivity growth. We're just not going to see that in most parts of the world, except here and parts of Africa and Indonesia. This is going to be an incredible asset and strength to have, a young, vibrant population as we look ahead. So labor productivity is a factor we have to think about, but also healthcare costs. Andrew Whitty can talk much more eloquently than I can, but the largest proportion of the healthcare costs for a human are consumed in the last couple of years of someone's life. And this is going to put very big pressures on government. So those are three forces that are coming our way. We're in the midst of them. They're going to accelerate, and I don't think anything in the markets or shifts, maybe geopolitics can affect it to some extent, but even that, I'm not so sure. It's going to lead to a lot of disruption and volatility. I'm an optimist, though, as one of my Chinese clients said, the 21st century should be wonderful for humankind if we can get through the first 30 years. But I think this change we're already seeing reflected in corporates. The average lifetime of a company has been shrinking. If you were in the S&P 500 in 1935, which I'd argue was not a great year to be in the S&P 500, your average lifetime was 90 years. In 2011, which is the last time we looked at it, it was 18 years. So 90 years to 18 years. Every 2 weeks, a company is going off that system. I might say that McKinsey's coming up to our 90th anniversary, so I, again, look at our medicine on that side and whether we're changing enough. The last part I wanted to talk about is, well, so what? What does that mean if you're a corporate or, frankly, if you're a government? And I think it means a lot in terms of how you think about strategy and being relevant. One of the underpinnings of our thinking on this is for every sector in the world, we've done what's called a power curve, which looks at where the economic profit is. That's the profit after your cost of capital. And it's a very familiar curve in every industry. And what's interesting about it is you typically see 90% of the profits being held in the top quintile. That top 20% accounts for 90% of the profit. And you see it in industry after industry. And you go, why is it that those players who are there, and how do you move from the middle or the other parts to that area? And what we found is the following, and we think it's something that we all need to look at, including ourselves. The first is maybe a pretty obvious one, but is focus on the trends. I talked about some of those shifts that were going on. It's very difficult, I think, to be a good manager in a bad industry or a tough industry. It's much better to be a mediocre manager in a great industry trend. So it's very important to be looking at those shifts, and there's a lot of them that are occurring that I think are actually quite exciting. So thinking very hard about what are the trends that you are going to ride, and by the way, what are the trends that you are going to get out of? And that gets to maybe to my second point on what you need to do from a strategy point of view. We found that the most successful organizations over time are those that reallocate their resources in the order of 10 to 15% a year. That's a very difficult thing to do. In my 30 years in McKinsey, I've never seen a business unit in a client come forward and say, I'd like less capital and less people next year. Everyone is growth-oriented. But those organizations that are actually able to reallocate in a very significant way do better over time. And that's something that our planning systems have to reflect, because it's very easy to look at last year and add percentages as opposed to reallocate in a more fundamental way. Radical cost restructuring. I think that many industries are now seeing with digitization that what's required in the business model redesign is dramatic cost reduction. It often involves at the same time significant investments. But we're looking at levels of 40% cost reduction. We're seeing this in the telecom industry in various different parts of the world. We're also seeing this in airplane manufacturing, automotive, and banking, but very significant, dramatic cost reduction. Digitization, we could talk about this for the rest of the evening, but I think everyone is digitizing. I think we're going to see a new role like the CFO, which is the Chief Digital Officer. The first CFO came into existence in about 1962. We think, in looking ahead, if you don't have a Chief Digital Officer to manage all of that data, which is different than a CIO, it's going to be challenging. Innovation, there's going to be some speakers after me talking, I think, much more eloquently about that, but I think the innovation engine is absolutely critical given the disruption, again, 90 years to 18 years. If you're not thinking about what parts of your business are going to be fundamentally different in 3 years from now, you may not be around. So again, just taking our own medicine, and it's my objective that 40% of what we do in McKinsey 3 years from now doesn't exist today. It has to, and I don't have a good calculation to say why that's the number. It's a feeling of the metabolic rate that's out there of change that's actually occurring. And the final point I'll make is that it's very difficult actually to predict in strategy. McKinsey is the firm, and my colleagues will get mad at me for saying this, that predicted in 1991 that the total demand for cell phones would be no more than 75,000 in our analysis that we did. So I think we have to have some humility when we're thinking about predicting, and I think what's actually more critical is how you organize yourselves to be able to be agile and how to be able to take advantage of the different trends and shifts. And we are seeing some very significant innovations in organization design, much flatter organizations. Most organizations we see are taking up anywhere between 3 to 4 levels out of their organization. Many of the new model organizations completely break the rules that we have. If you look at Inditex, the Spanish retailer, they have over 100 direct reports to the CEO. If you look at Apple and Tim Cook, and the changes that actually occur in the direct reports on a 6-month basis, it's not what's taught in business school. So the fundamental views of how organizations work, and I think a lot of those innovations are happening here in India and in China. Hire went from an 80,000 person organization in a classic structured way to having 2,000 separate business units. Very radical, flattening, decentralizing to allow speed as we move ahead. And I think finally this has implications for leadership, how we lead organizations in dealing with all of this volatility. I think it's going to take a lot more courage because you cannot get sidetracked by markets, which may be an odd thing for someone from McKinsey to say, but I think markets are sending very bizarre signals as we go through it. It's time to go back to the fundamentals on the trends and have a long view, and then think about how you position yourselves and gut it as you go through and build something great for the long term. Thank you very much for listening.